Uh, okay, in this recording, I'm going to hopefully have made another recording with the same title, so it's a bit embarrassing and annoying at least. I'm going to recapitulate, hopefully more concisely and also more incisively, into the issues surrounding debating or arguing with proponents of critical race theory, or at least advocates who are sympathetic to that intellectual schema or that worldview or that kind of intellectual framing. Now, uh, I do this in some sense in specific response. I'm part of some Facebook group which is a bit heterodox, and people debate things around uh, issues which I think predominantly come up in sort of surrounding Brett Weinstein, um, who is, sort of on the left, but not part of the woke progressive left, and he takes on identity politics, perhaps to some degree. I think that he doesn't have clear enough principled stand against the intellectual, let's say. um, he, I think in Brett Weinstein's own thinking, he is he doesn't have enough protection, or he doesn't have enough of a fundamental disagreement and rejection of uh, the kind of moral horse trading that goes on within identity politics, which is ironically what this issue is kind of about. Um, in terms of how Brett Weinstein, sort of talks about racial issues and things like that, I think that he's not incisive enough in distinguishing a cohesive or cogent worldview that actually, in principle, rejects identity politics. I think he is often intellectually soft on it. He has intellectual sympathies, which, in some sense, make him, I think, inconsistent in his so-called his rejection of identity politics is not clearly based on an intellectual principled stance. It's just a kind of, well, sort of, it leads to more problems or something like that. It's an indictment of a kind that isn't very intellectually grounded. I'll just say that. So he anyway. I've made recordings that specifically get into Brett Weinstein's own sympathies and things like that. Anyway, I mean, this is kind of in the ballpark of what I want to talk about. So, anyway, there is two recordings that someone, a member of this Facebook group, has cited, and the person who brings these videos to bear is someone who considers himself a kind of as a leftist, and he doesn't like critical race theory, but he is in some sense expressly intellectually, he is formulaically intellectually sympathetic with it, but his own preference for making progress would be, a more class-based Marxian, sort of, which is interesting because in some sense, I have some intellectual, uh, I have some very, I don't know how to put this. I could say that I'm intellectually sensitive to some Marxist analysis, but that is very, I think I have uh, enough of a solid understanding that is critical of Marxian ideology, that I can contextualize that analysis and I can use it to inform my thinking without falling into the fundamental problem around it. And I am going to, anyway. So this guy, he puts up these two videos. It's very interesting. It's someone who's part of a YouTube channel, or maybe it's also a television channel, I don't know, or it's some kind of podcast or something like that. But it's actually the name of this channel, and which looks like a television produced sort of program. You know, the production values of it look like it could be a TV show, and it literally calls itself Black News, and then there's a third word which I'm not sure, but it's a BNC is what the name of this channel is, or what the name. Anyway, but the BN stands for Black News, and the host of this, his name is Marc Lamont Hill. Okay, and so he is, you know, it's interesting that all these sort of apologists for CRT, they don't explicitly endorse it. They sort of they prop it up, sort of saying that they are philosophically permissive of it, and that they are, you know, sympathetic with its, and that they basically say that it's got a bad rap, it's been caricatured, it's been lampooned, and you know, and so this person actually brings on James Lindsay, and then he kind of he gets James Lindsay to set up a critique, and then he sort of takes James Lindsay. He seemingly takes James Lindsay to task. I think he doesn't actually do that. He grapples with James Lindsay, but he doesn't even throw a punch. This is how I describe it in my response, or my my survey at what actually went on. He doesn't even throw a punch, let alone failing to land a punch against James Lindsay. And anyway, and then but I think that these recordings are perfect encapsulations as to the fundamental. I mean, if you study this and you study what I'm going to say about these recordings, I think. Well, anyway, I'm using the topic of this is I'll probably title this video or this recording, you know, sort of the fundamental difficulty of arguing with proponents of critical race theory. And, you know, I repeat some of the themes that I've gone into before, but I think in my response to these recordings, which I've written out, which I'm going to probably get into and try to discuss in this recording now, I get into some interesting facets, which, you know, I still haven't composed this perfectly cogently. So hopefully, you know, in talking about it, it'll. So let me give an overview, which is, you know, in some sense to start with a conclusion, and then I'll go through the substantiation for this. The reason why it's so fundamentally problematic to argue with critical race theory is that it's a worldview. James Lindsay makes this point as well. I think he makes it quite. What's the word? I can't think of the word, but he quite. It's quite sobering, you know, when James Lindsay has said a lot of beautifully concise things that really make it problematic. But essentially, because it's fundamentally a worldview, and it's very similar to Marxist ideology in this way. Like, the reason why Marxist ideology fundamentally runs awry is because it's not technically wrong, and it can't be proven to be wrong because it's premised in a hypothesis. The core Marxian hypothesis is essentially that capitalism is not sustainable. Therefore, you are granted permission to imagine and to openly theorize about the possibility of supplanting capitalism, which must be understood by deconstructing it. Therefore, so you kind of you facilitate a deconstructive negative project of displacing something because of the hypothesis that it's fundamentally unsustainable. In the same way that, like, and so essentially Marxist ideology is essentially born out of something that is already taken for granted. The hypothesis is taken for granted that capitalism is fundamentally doomed, and therefore we have to grant ourselves the latitude to find a way to kind of deconstruct and reorder its constituent ingredients and try to cleanse or purify or do something within that cauldron. And so the fight against, or the ultimate end of displacing capitalism is a necessity, is therefore taken for granted that is just a kind of a logical necessity, in the same way that, sort of structural oppression is seen as, it's a necessary, logical, it's just taken for granted that must be opposed, that needs to be modulated or sort of now it's more, I would say, that in the critical race kind of worldview, that whole procedure right there is done almost nakedly. It's done, sort of like, obviously systemic oppression is something that needs to be ameliorated, is something that needs to be combated and offset or deconstructed or sort of, we have to do something about it. And in some sense, that is the fundamental axle that grants them the imagination, because essentially, that the means will be justified by the ends, because the ends involve negating systemic oppression, which is essentially something like the ultimate negative value or the ultimate evil or something like that, or something that is so endemic and insipid, but it really is the source of all, or the mother of all, sort of moral deficiency that goes under the radar, and so it's sort of it's kind of the most noxious of all moral sins not to root out or confront or something like that. And so there's a kind of, it hinges on a kind of on a moral panic around the necessity to engage in some kind of political project or sociological control of that metric of what is assumed to be like a negative evil or something like that. So I would say that is the fundamental flaw of critical race theory or critical theory in general, is how it conflates essentially moral philosophy and moral consideration with a kind of sociological reduction. And it very quickly doesn't even try to substantiate this point. It's just taken for granted. And essentially, instead of making this point in moral philosophy, they will very quickly substantiate it through making an empirical claim, which is fundamentally problematic, because essentially they are relying on what is called in moral philosophy epistemic reliabilism, which is the exact thing that makes it impossible to comport oneself or conduct oneself as an epistemic responsibilist. So their whole paradigm is devoid of epistemic responsibilism because it is dependent on epistemic reliabilism. And in some sense, they don't even take ownership of this epistemic reliabilism, because they can say that, no, we're not committed to epistemic reliabilism. We're actually trying to exhaust the epistemic reliabilism that our model is saddled with confronting. So essentially, they don't even take ownership of their own conflation, because they say that they're combating it. It's the process of doing the means to justify the ends. So it's like, they say, well, we are not responsible for this paradigm. We're just dealing with it. We're reacting to it. It's being imposed on us. And then again, they make an they make an empirical assessment of that, which they can't, because how do you get an ought from an is? So they are fundamentally locked into fobbing off that basic, I don't, so essentially, this is why I think they have been often correctly essentially tarred as being, sort of having this aura of divine revelation, because essentially they are standing on a soapbox, delivering a moral diatribe about a worldview paradigm that is essentially all-encompassing, and they can't actually substantiate for it. They can't argue it. They are just deploying a narrative. And yes, they've got, let's say, some kind of semantic matrix of internal consistency, but it's not internally coherent in terms of its reasons or whatever. It doesn't deal honestly with issues of sort of agency and structure and things like that. And that basic fudging, in some sense, which gets lost in the semantic structure of it, and which facilitates them, playing semantic definitional games about what it is that they say that they're doing according to their own mentality. The only way to expose this is to focus in on morality, essentially, and what they are doing to morality and what they are doing to self-determinism and responsibility in the individual, which is essentially completely mistreated, or it's obtusely abstracted and generalized, because they're primarily concerned with categorical group belonging, I guess, or membership, which they will say, well, that is just, they're not happy to do that, but that just happens to be the reflection of reality. It's like, oh, they don't want to see the world through this lens, but the world is forcing them to see it through this lens, and that is a kind of intellectual, you can just notice that is a kind of, that is a game that all sort of, it's kind of like a skeptical trick that essentially you don't have, you can avoid positively substantiating your position or your point of view if you just say, well, somebody else has to prove the negative as to why I can't say that this is the only way of making reason out of this, So it's sort of, they just claim to have the default epistemological, anyway. But I mean, in some sense, this is much better understood from essentially the dichotomy of epistemic reliabilism and epistemic responsibilism. And so if you have an epistemic reliabilism paradigm, it's morally obtuse, it's morally disgusting, it's repugnant, it's morally monstrous. You can't actually be prescriptive, or it's a fundamentally poisonous. It's like I mean, the analogy here is in medicine, it's like epidemiology. You can use it to trace suspicious activity, but you still have to then recapitulate what you think is going. When you actually develop a hypothesis, you have to start from first principles. You can't use the epidemiology. You can use the epidemiology as a shallow, superficial tool to give you a kind of algorithmic, go see if you can look at this cluster of statistics. It doesn't tell you how to interpret things, and you can anyway. So, it's a very dangerous instrument, essentially, and it is morally bankrupt to begin with, fundamentally, and it never fills that void. It never substantiates itself morally, except by saying that the grievance is such a moral panic that we have to use the semantic matrix because it is a necessary means to an expedient ends that is going to achieve the greatest good the fastest, or something like that. And we don't have the time to look at ulterior worldviews because this is a moral emergency. That's actually how it sort of gets away with itself in practice. Now, intellectually, there is a slightly different aspect to this. I'm going to just read my response now to these videos. Okay, this is kind of awkward. When I was moving around on my phone to read my pieces, which I did so, I didn't realize that I stopped recording, so I lost 16 minutes of some beautifully cogent thinking. Man, that is actually really heartbreaking. Okay, well, anyway, I'm going to try to reproduce the thought process that I went through. Sadly, I don't think I'll do as well. I really did do very well, but anyway, it was actually a very concise 16 minutes. Okay, let me read my first remark. The second comment that I wrote is better than the first. Man, I can't remember exactly how I set this up last time. So, I'm sorry if some of this is a repeat. So, I am responding to a video from the Black News channel, and the host of this, of at least the video that I'm responding to, is called Marc Lamont Hill, and this has all been brought to my attention by someone on a Facebook group who is saying, that he wants to have similar discussions or something like that, or that he similarly thinks that people are wrong in their critique of critical race theory. So I'm commenting on these people's defense of the formula behind critical race theory, or at least the species of ideology. And when I do this, I directly, I think, confront and outline the issue and the problem of debunking critical race theory. Anyway, let me get into it. Okay, so in this video, Marc Lamont Hill had James Lindsay on the program, and also somebody else who is who associates with James Lindsay, and they perhaps had a joint piece of writing which they were there to discuss, which was critical and made to sort of detract and complain about the. Anyway, it was negative about critical race theory and how it was intellectually defended. I would say that it wasn't that James Lindsay was there to be outshone in some way or to be fobbed off, and that's exactly what he was there essentially to prove a point. But that point was, I think, fundamentally was a kind of propaganda construction. Anyway, I'm going to get into it. Anyway, now I'm just labeling this. I don't mean to be labeling this. I would rather get into the substantive issue. Okay, so I said, I think this was a hit job. This limited timed interaction was set up to facilitate the host producing this nebulous diatribe that seeks to prove hypothetically that there is a clean rebuttal to James Lindsay's critique of critical race theory. The host makes claims which he does not substantiate. He merely mentions the heading of his contradiction, but it amounts simply to semantic gainsaying, in which he doesn't even define the contradictory semantic spin that he rests his claims on. I.e., this is very close to a quote of what the host actually says, of what Marc Lamont says. He says, that is not the meaning of structure or systems. So he basically says, he's saying that, when you criticize critical race theory, you're turning it into a caricature, because that's not what they mean by structure and systems. And then he fails to give his definition of what a system or a structure is, or simply settling on recapitulating Lindsay's case about how it's used by social justice progressives. Anyway, I go into elaborating this point in a bit, but essentially what he's doing is he's saying, like, let me prove that I know what you are saying, James Lindsay. I can describe your own point, your own criticism against the point. So he relanguages the criticism to prove that he does understand that James Lindsay's critique, and then he basically says, but you're relying on a definition of these words which isn't what these people mean when they use the words. That's essentially what he's saying. James then immediately asks him to provide his position on structural determinism, and the host repeats a similar fobbing off of the issue by resting on a mere semantic definitional contrivance which he fails to substantiate or coherently set out. Again, he merely states that his view contradicts James's, but fails to delineate that contrary view, merely describing James's view and commenting that it's inaccurate and inadequate. So he doesn't actually give a real answer to James, although he claims that he does have a real answer. All he does is obscure his contradiction in vague language that he titles as psychological, essentially, which obviously has a fascistic spin of how structures will amount into some embarrassing conflation with an overdetermined social psychology. So, everything becomes this weird realm of social psychology that has this moral weight in that has to be the central, sort of that forces us to look at it and confront it. Essentially, I mean, that is actually that's kind of the hidden hook, which is never substantiated. But essentially is what the whole sort of critical race theory hinges on, is that, you have to solve this problem. So therefore, if you don't have an answer to this problem, then shut up and let us get on with it, or this is a real moral panic. Anyway, but essentially what is happening is that he's saying he doesn't actually explain that he's not essentially saying why James is wrong. He is just saying why James could be wrong, because here are the colors, or here are the ingredients that can be rearranged into constructing a complicated, nuanced, and sophisticated worldview in which all of the things that James says are being violated or being obtusely, or being manhandled, or being poorly, like essentially are being obscured or obfuscated, that they are actually capable of being accounted for, because here are some vague headings and here are some vague subjects which can be part of the critical race theory narrative, that can be part of the semantic definitional matrix. But he doesn't actually say how these things can be coherently set out, or he doesn't paint a picture with those colors. He just says, look, I have these colors that could still be used to enliven and to hash out. So anyway, I believe that this whole discussion was a ploy to produce the gist of some skeptical doubt against James Lindsay's position, which is what usually passes on the left these days for intellectual merit. The host is basically saying, look, I clearly understand the case being made by Lindsay and the people who agree with him, and I disagree with their case, and I promise you that my disagreement works in theory. It's just more complicated and hinges on using a more sophisticated understanding and definition of agency and structures and psychology, involving some overdetermined socio-political model of social psychology. I'm slightly elaborating, from my interpretation of his, sort of vague diatribe of hashing out all these other issues that essentially that James Lindsay is that it's complained that James Lindsay has been insensitive to in his reading of the critical race theory literature and such. So the host, Marc Lamont, he doesn't even properly outline this posited disagreement. He merely provides a nebulous framework from which possibilities of semantic philosophical trickery might be imagined, which basically amounts to the ad hominem against James Lindsay, that James Lindsay just doesn't understand the height or the intelligence in the people who he disagrees with. Which is then couched in a pretense of superficial semantic sparring. But the host didn't even throw a punch, never mind failing to land anything. This was simply grappling in order to signal to the feeble-minded that James doesn't have an able means of countering the argument that wasn't actually ever put to James. And then I just, in parentheses, I made a point here that it's actually correct to label this stuff pushback, because essentially this is what has come to displace argument these days. That it gives you the ability to just kind of retort some narrative theme that vaguely, sort of fills in and fudges what would be an actual argument, because no substantiation has ever been placed on the table in the first place. But you're probably dealing with someone who, in some sense, doesn't even believe in reason itself, because that's a product of colonial oppression or some stuff like that. Anyway, there's a further important point. It's an interesting part of this recording, the primary video, which I'll obviously give links to, is that part in this exchange near the beginning, James Lindsay actually makes quite a clever point, which wasn't properly digested in this exchange. But James Lindsay, in the same vein as complaining that people are essentially insulating themselves from real discourse and real debate by essentially shutting down the conversation, by shutting down debate and free speech, by sort of claiming control of the language and making certain, sort of the utterance of certain concepts, even and the use of certain words, are just sort of are beyond the pale, or just removed from the table. And that's basically almost like a kind of totalitarian game that's being played through semantics. And then James Lindsay says, quite wryly and cleverly, I think, because in some sense he's not actually he's making a substantive point which goes over the head of the host, where he says, please don't use the word folk. That is actually offensive, because folk has a historical reason for its development, and it's a very nasty sort of development. And in some sense, when James Lindsay is saying, I'm offended by the use of the word folk, he is actually making a deeper substantive claim about a worldview and a value system. He's saying that the use of this word is literally connected to a value system. And when he says, I'm offended by your use of this word, in some sense that needs to actually be translated in the context of this discourse, that he's actually not saying, I'm offended by your use of the word, I'm actually offended by your value system, because your value system essentially is always using this word. Your value system is premised in a kind of relativistic worldview on the behalf of folk entities. Anyway, let me just read this point. Lindsay's critique of the use of the word folk is also not a predominantly semantic claim, which it seems is the only kind of claim which the host is capable of entertaining and consuming. It rests on a deeper claim about value systems, but someone who is engaged in a project of black news is already completely embedded into the folk worldview and framework, a point that seems to get completely over the host's head, while he was avoiding having a discourse over that clash of values and attempting himself to produce a tongue-in-cheek proof to affirm the host's semantic and relativistic diplomatic form of discourse that holds the participants in that discourse should be regarded as representatives of two factional group or folk, needing to equally share the linguistic ground between their intersectional categories, and which also places the source of moral consideration into those group entities. Morality for the host is grounded in providing respect to folk, not respect to individuals, but respect to categories. So, in some sense, when Lindsay says, I am offended by your use of that word, that is a bit of a Trojan horse in some sense, because what he's actually being offended by is the worldview of the other person. It's not the actual word itself. It's the actual value structure of the other person that he's essentially taking offense with. And it's interesting because in some sense it doesn't matter what the vehicle is. It matters what the occupant, the content, the context disguise. The substance needs to be rescued from the context, and you can see who is on the side of just base ostensible superficial consequences, and who is actually having a discourse on values. Anyway, I'm not describing this that well, but man, my first recording was so much better than this. Okay, anyway, let me move on. next paragraph, and then I just go on to lament, basically, these people who are a part of the social justice left, they have no principles that allow them to engage in discourse as an individual, with their own individual form of responsibility or integrity, or to have their own form of individual responsibility or integrity. It is truly disgusting watching them fabricate the outward and ostensible procedural form of discourse. It truly makes one think how the culture of Weimar Germany gave way to this kind of slave morality and group relativism that came to replace all standards of integrity in discourse. The Black News Channel might as well be the Aryan News Channel, as critical race studies might as well be the Aryan studies of our time, and similarly the source of this monster, critical theory, can similarly be correlated to the Darwinism theory fad that was popular with the academy in that epoch. We suffer from the same philosophical slide of values and bullshit, with just a different covering and a new spin on the same psychological profile of useful idiots, basing morality in group consciousness and other disgusting generalizations and formalized semantic games of redefining morality away from the ambit of ethics, held up by a growing orthodoxy of group category moral essentialism. Sorry, that's a four-hyphened term, or that's a term with 3 hyphens and 4 words, excuse me. The projection of social psychology that displaces the need for individualistic standards of accountability. Anyway, my next comment on the second video is gets to the heart of why I'm making this recording, because I make much better arguments there that get into why it is actually essentially impossible to argue against critical race theory, and I mean that in a technical sense. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to move on. Okay, so I have a YouTube channel. Okay, so he just makes a second video where he actually asks if anyone is interested to debate about this stuff. And this guy, he says, he's actually he's a leftist, he's a Marxist, but he doesn't like critical race theory. He would prefer a more sort of class-based Marxist ideology, which is interesting because, I'm myself somewhat sensitive to some Marxist analysis, but I think that I know what the line is. And so I use Marxist analysis in the same way that someone would use epidemiology. It doesn't tell you anything real. It just tells you it's some blunt instrument to look at an issue and to kind of jostle it a bit and to shake it out a bit with some dialectical, sort of, it's like it's a blunt sort of tool of deconstruction, but you still have to, those elements that you extract from that analysis are morally poisonous. They can't be used without starting afresh from first principles. You can't extract useful analysis from epidemiology. Okay. Sorry. Let me just wade into it then. So he actually, this guy, he invited people, if anyone wants to debate him or talk about it on his YouTube channel, something like that. So anyway, I just said I have a YouTube channel myself where I give critique of this kind of ideology. Although I do not focus my energy into presenting my content in a highly consumable form, I do believe I am able to create a positive influence through seeding some ideas into the clash of ideas on issues like this. I am slightly perturbed by your framing of this issue. It seems like you are looking for an easy out. Sorry, I didn't mention in the setup that he describes that people are very bad at debating with critical race theory. He says that people are looking at it at the wrong level of abstraction, and that they mischaracterize it, and that they basically lampoon it, but they're not actually dealing with it properly. So I just said, it seems like you were looking for an easy out because you were taking the position of a hard skeptic and expecting the debunker to prove a negative. Critical race theory needs to advance a positive substantive set of coherent claims. It does not. Just because you trip people up in the weeds of its internal self-inconsistency, in the minutiae of its deeply damaging psychological assertions that advance the displacement of responsibility and self-determinism with the notions of a fascistic form of social psychology. Obviously, critiquing anything requires the claim that it is being accurately reduced or summarized into a form that can then be the target of a counter-argument. The kind of abstraction that critical race theory approaches within its analysis of reality is a fundamental paradox of moral philosophy, which enforces a moral calculus which is applied on the level of group guilt. It is the inherent moral claim critical race theory makes, which essentially states that the source of moral consideration is fundamentally encoded into categories of group belonging. This is a specious argument that conflates the realm of moral philosophy with sociology as a blanket assertion, and it's performed so nakedly in the fashion of this maneuver is a means that will be justified by the ends it may lead to and produce. This is a form of intellectually bankrupted Ponzi scheme and fudging, because technically and hypothetically, it might possibly work out. It might be able to get away with itself, essentially. But it has done nothing to make a positive substantiation for this view. Instead, the significance of the grievance is what is relied on and touted as an overriding moral panic, while no survey of comparative self-assessment of its worldview is ever entertained. It's unembarrassed about its practical and sociological reliance on moral panic. Essentially, it makes no time to consider an alternative worldview. It becomes immoral to expect this time or attention to be paid by the promoters of critical race theory. Essentially, they have no alternative to turn to because the problem is so serious and grave. Critical race theory is evil on the basis of its actual framing of morality, which is a very hard argument for its detractors to make against it. When someone can produce hollow statistical and other cherry-picked hyperbolic and radical narratives around some necessity to use the semantic definitional matrix that infers the sociological planning that is in theory capable of providing the control or amelioration for its definition of oppression. So what I'm trying to say in that very long sentence is that the whole thing is an elaborate and giant exercise of circular reasoning in the moral landscape. Critical race theory defines evil in such a way that it displaces a form of problem solving in the realm of morality with a project of sociological control. It is a disgusting fixed sociological correlation between a sociological model of structures or systems and morality, so that it can insist on its own semantic matrix of reality of then morally charged items and objects, insulating itself from its critics. Excuse me. Okay, now this is the most important crux, because I'm seemingly going to contradict what I've just said. It doesn't have to it doesn't even have to admit that it is making this move of insulating itself from its critics, because it isn't technically committed to this moral conflating with sociology. That is just the nature of the moral panic that has been claimed to be empirically evident. So in parentheses I say here, this is a bait and switch move used by its apologists, detracting from its fudged morality as it pivots into an empirical assessment. It is using a disgusting form of epistemic reliabilism and thus makes it impossible for its adherents to be epistemic responsibilists within the framework of of critical race theory, which is the mark that this ideological framework is actually a form of slave which is the mark that evidence. I'm making this claim, so I'm just trying to word this so it rolls better. This is then the mark of an ideological framework which is actually a form of slave morality, which is the case for all forms of epistemic reliabilism. I'm basically just saying that this all hinges around epistemic reliabilism. Excuse me. Okay, ergo, arguing about critical race theory is a form of semantic game playing, and this miscreant from the Black News channel is just as disgusting as any other apologist of Aryan studies was in Weimar Germany. Critical theory is the new fad of what Darwin theory was from that dark time, and your ilk is the same kind of useful idiot that led to the normalization of fascistic values and Nazi philosophy. Anyway, and then I gave a link to my channel if you was interested in my content or whatever. Furthermore, critical race theory cannot therefore be argued against, and I mean argue in a technical way here, because it never sets itself up within the framework of an argument. It's a system of analysis that contains a prospective hypothesis, much the same way as Marx's primary hypothesis is the basis for permission to imagine arguments against capitalism, which are intellectually invested within deconstructing capitalism, this is all fundamentally rooted from the hypothesis that capitalism is not sustainable. So if you take it as a given that capitalism is not sustainable, then you have to deconstruct it and imagine how to supplant it and reorder its ingredients and work out how it can be transmutated or something like that. So because critical race theory merely claims to be some kind of self-consistent system of thought or worldview, and as I have claimed that it is essentially a giant exercise in circular reasoning within moral philosophy, and that it has two main sources of reactive intellectual bastions for its defense, in parentheses, the semantic claims and sociological control that is planned to disrupt its definition of what it defines as oppression. So, its two intellectual defenses of its worldview is that, well, it has, this is what things mean semantically. It has semantic claims about defining the world in a certain matrix of conceptual web. And then it can say, well, we offer a sociological plan that controls this evil of oppression. And in some sense, the semantic claim is probably related to the the empirical evidence and the statistics is very much, sort of embedded in supporting the semantic extension and deployment. That's how they usually defend their semantic claims that are just, well, look at the statistics, and then the sociological plan is essentially all related into, well, obviously this is a problem, therefore we have to gear towards some kind of way to control this form of evil, which is systemic. Even though it's that I argue has a fundamental moral paradox embedded within it, but it can also rely on the empirical, statistical, semantic leg to also cover. The one can be used to cover the other and create a kind of circular reasoning, but also a kind of infinite regress as well between those two arms. Anyway, so it's therefore the theory of critical race theory can therefore only be contended against through reproducing it within a counter-polemic, it can only be effectively answered by reconstituting some alternative model of correct worldview or psychology, because that is the only thing that can encapsulate a totalitarian worldview, another similarly robust and all-encompassing psychological schema. So, it is such a broad worldview that the only way to contend against it is to create a similarly broad worldview that can actually account for it and show it to be defective and deficient, which is, quite sad, because it forces people to actually, have some, at least they have to have a worldview which is deeply rooted and sophisticated enough that it can actually explain why critical race theory is essentially morally bankrupt and in practice a kind of mind virus, but that from principled stand is deficient. But essentially that is also a fundamental clash of values at the end of the day, which means that also fundamentally it can't be argued. It's essentially that's the sad thing, is that it will say, well, look, I have my worldview, which is a narrative, and you can have a different narrative that contradicts my narrative, but we both just have narratives. And in some sense, I would argue that that's a weakness from the critical race theory minded people, is because, the fundamental argument against it is basically the same argument that exists against epistemic reliabilism. And I would point people towards the work Moral Agency, or Epistemic Agency, by Catherine Elgin. Critical race theory is devoid of moral integrity. It's an intellectual scheme used by very destructive and dysfunctional personality or psychological structures, and this is evident when you simply survey its adherents. Virtue signaling, collective narcissism, what I would describe as cerebral histrionics. The identity is basically a form of borderline disordered sort of cult, facilitating the same kind of reality tunnel relativism and secondary psychopathy perpetrated by borderlines, but here it's done in the name of an ideology, essentially. But man, this is 35 minutes. There's no way that I lost 16 minutes. I must have lost double that. In fact, the time that I calculated it from, it must actually, when I stop recording, it must make a timestamp at the end of the recording, not at the beginning. Anyway, so, okay, there are 2 points that I want to add onto this. Man, I was so much more eloquent in the first time. I mean, it was slightly rough in other ways, but it was actually much more organically fluid. I'm very sad that I lost that recording. Anyway, again, this wasn't a perfect, concise, polished thing, but I think in substance I have covered why it's fundamentally problematic. Then what I did last time is, to round it off, I just added some of my psychobabble, which doesn't, this is my esoteric psychology, and it only plugs in if you follow my other speculative research in personality modeling. So this means nothing to anyone else, but except for the people that are interested in that. But so I was just going to say that that this is what I would relate to the devotion, which is the basis of the sense the subjective sense of that you be. The devotion provides for that subjective sense of that you be. It is the core. Anyway, and the devotion is archetypally, I would link to male, symbolically the male gender. It is the active force that is setting up the groundwork to the image of that you be. And that is a very, in some sense, that's also symbolic of order. Jordan Peterson had a very nice recording recently. We're talking about order and chaos. And it's interesting that, obviously archetypally, male masculinity is order and femininity is chaos. This was also essentially explored in Greek mythology, between Eros and Concordia, which were sort of both feminine tropes in some sense. In the Roman translation, it's I actually am. Yeah, man, I think I messed it up. I think wasn't Concordia in the Greek. It was Harmonia. It was Eros and Harmonia. And in the Roman, it's Concordia and Discordia. Anyway, which are both forms of chaos. They're both feminine forms of chaos. Or actually, no. Eros and Discordia are chaos. Harmonia and Concordia, which are the same entity essentially, is kind of agreement, I guess. But Eros had an interesting double. Eros, the Greek god of chaos, the feminine, had two sides to her. She had a kind of chaos which was malevolent and purely destructive, and she also had a chaos which was like a precursor towards a higher synthesis or a higher level of order. That it was a kind of generative, creative contribution. And so these two faces of Eros were part of the understanding of chaos, at least in the trope of a feminine archetype. Anyway, the point here is that the devotion itself, that which I've just associated also with masculine energy, or the devotion within my psychological modeling, is very much related to, I think, collective narcissism, order. I mean, I would also correlate it with just the theme in general of order, but it is also very related to sexual energy and sexuality. And I think that these are the primary factors of what has gone awry in our current sort of cultural predicament. That it's interesting that we have a kind of parasitic chaos, a malevolent kind of Eros, who actually has a kind of homosexual, archetypally has a homosexual connection with itself, that it won't connect with any masculine energy. It will only connect to another malevolent, destructive Eros, that it just is spiraling in its self-congratulatory, that there's a helpful chaos that says, no, I reject that order because I want a higher level synthesis. I'm holding out for something better. But you actually have to have a vision of what that better thing is. You actually have to have the hope that there is actually something to get in the place of the thing that of the order that you're rejecting. It actually has to be the precursor to something. And that is what is missing in the, Sam Vaknin, when he talks about the unisex gender that we now sort of are saddled with. He describes it as that women are modeling themselves after psychopathic men, psychopathic narcissistic men. I don't think that that's true. I think it is actually a feminine identity that they are embodying. And in some sense, I think that it is, in some sense, parasitic on male sexual energy. Because in some sense, it's even explicit, I would argue, in the ideology of the feminist ideology and intersectionality, because white male patriarchy is the scapegoat from which you can imagine, you are given license to imagine whatever you may want to reject. So it's the glue that fixes, that fills in whatever gap there might be. So, because you can always say, well, the white matriarchal, the white male patriarchy in the future should do this, and in the past it should have done that. And then we would already live in a utopia, which I'm allowed to imagine, because if only the white male patriarchy had already done this, which it should have done, and should do this in the future, then this would be fixed. So you kind of have a way in which you can subvert reality as long as you've got a scapegoat to absorb the burden and the grievance, essentially. So all you have to do is generate the complaint and the grievance, and you've got a port of call for or a source, an energy source that should be able to replicate any imagined, that should be able to support. And all you have to do is denigrate that scapegoat identity. All you have to do is call it evil, and then you get your license to imagine whatever alternative you want. So it's an extractive, it's born out of the scapegoating of the devotion, and in some sense that means that you can't ever have a stable devotion. You can't have a stable definition of a sense of self. Now, it's interesting, I just want to make the correlating point that Sam Vaknin, in his own discussion of sexuality, points out, that sex is diminishing, that sex itself is, from the culture, from people's actual lives, in some sense, that sexlessness, or at least a very kind of dysfunctional sex, is becoming the norm. And I would argue it's because of this ideology, and it's because of this fascistic culture, essentially, because the devotion is also what is being explored in intimacy, because you're toying with the renegotiation, you're reimagining what the devotion is, but you're doing that within the confines of play. Whereas now, this whole political ideological project of politicizing sexuality, or the politics of sexuality, or the politics of sexual energy, or I would rather even say male sexual energy, the projection onto male sexual energy by an ideology, and I mean this in the context that, I think that we are all fundamentally, from an alchemical point of view, from the level of archetype, we are all hermetic, that we need to have both within all of us, and that's the only way that also you can relate to the other one. We need to inculcate both. But anyway, let me not get too off topic. is that people don't want to have an internal locus of control over their devotion. They want there to be a universal objective framework which is imposed and enforced from the top down. And in some sense, this facilitates. Excuse me. I'm trying to get over the flu at the moment. What this does is that it facilitates individuals that have a kind of sadistically edged field marshalling and that there are people in the world who are sort of wolf in sheep's clothing, and they need to belong to a herd or a community in which the rules are laid down and they are blindly prescribed and enforced, so that they can be wolves in sheep's clothing. And the point here is that, without strict social conventions, people can't get their sadistically edged grift on. They can't implant within the narrative their own private denigration of other people. They have a kind of sadistically edged, I would even say, sexuality as well. But essentially, these are people who don't have a... This is hard to say because this is not just like a fixed subject, but these are people who essentially they don't have, in some sense, layers of intimacy. They want a... oh man, I described this so much better in the last recording. This is quite sad, but you can see this when in Weimar Germany, in terms of fascistic cultures, that the politics of the state is very infantilizing. It takes the state becomes like a family unit, and there's a kind of automatic protection over your sexual energy is plugged into an overarching program and structure and system where everyone is forced to play a role in some kind of sociological narrative or something like that. In some sense, there's a kind of there's a conscription into a kind of roles that need to be played. And this is very suitable to these types of psychologically structured individuals that don't want to set up through negotiation and persuasion their own operating grounds of having a community and sharing a game that is being played. They want the game to be imposed and enforced, and they want there to be an objective, universal, singular game, because essentially their kind of how they play and how they operate is fundamentally sadistic, and so they need there to be a compulsive authoritarian element that will compel people to stick by the set of rules that then they can exploit. So these people are addicted to sort of systems of soft power, or that traditionally in the West have been, there's been a distinction between cultural soft power and, let's say, legal frameworks and order and institutional hard power. Anyway, these are people that want to conflate those lines, essentially. And in some sense, it has to do with sort of merging sexuality or sexual energy into a kind of political state or structure. Anyway, okay, I'm describing this quite badly, but I just wanted to say that this issue of the devotion, which I'm archetypally relating to symbolically masculinity and male energy, is also very much to do with sexuality itself. That it can be toyed with and played with, but this is usually, at least in the classical liberal, at least British, kind of mentality. This is something that, stiff upper lip politeness in society, and that's for your personal bedroom, or your freedom of association to construct. It's not to be indulged in some kind of sort of, it's improper to it was kind of like the secular distinction between within the private sphere or something like that. Anyway, what am I saying? So anyway, I just think that is what is being sort of parasitically cornered in order to indulge in a kind of malevolent, chaotic, destructive urge, which I'm saying is kind of, in terms of its unigender, is kind of only interested in teaming up with itself and projecting its power politically. And this is why I think that sexuality is so messed up and at the moment. Now, if you excuse me to draw this distinction as well, Germany has a reputation for sexual kink and fetishes and things like that. And I mean, I don't know if that even is statistically true or empirically bears itself out. But anyway, it suits. If it does turn out to be true, it suits my current thesis, essentially, which is that I think that if it is true, it's a holdover from the fascistic culture that it lived through. And I think that when you have so much sexual energy invested in this universal objective paradigm, which is, that everyone is automatically plugged into, and is, through their avatar of their social psychology, of their identity faction or intersectional, kind of that when you are living in that kind of unidimensional paradigm, that when you do then interact in sexuality, that you are perhaps driven into having to express it or indulge in it or experiment with it, instead of it has to be quite visceral. It has to be quite crude in its it has to be quite embodied. It can't be, sexuality loses its sophistication. It loses its deeply internal intimacy and relatedness. It doesn't have the deep connection inside one's own psychology, because that has already been projected onto the social narrative and the social stage, which is this objective expression supposedly of yourself. You can see this in show who you are on the inside. That your identity is a reflection of what you are in the inside. And I think that is also essentially it's completely believing in this external locus of control, in this external representation of a kind of epistemic reliabilism. So you're so enraptured in the slave morality that the only way to even explore your own sexuality at that point, or to engage in intimacy, is through an elaborate externalization and sort of with things like, I mean, the thing that I'm sort of talking about in terms of the kinky German stuff is sort of, I mean, is the elaborate sort of domination stuff. But I mean, that also thematically, you could also see how that is connected with the totalitarian fascistic infantilization and sort of the authority, and that there is love in that kind of obedience within, anyway. So the whole sort of dominatrix trope or whatever, I mean, I guess perhaps that is for some reason that is one of the most well known, I mean, just as a kind of as a stereotype, as a cartoon, that is one of the most well known fetishes. That is associated with Germans. Anyway, so yeah, I just I'm just talking about that in passing, I guess. But yeah, I think it, to me, it's deeply worrying. I really made very good recordings, I think, exactly describing the kind of sexual dysfunction of the people on the that believe in this kind of modern feminism and critical race theory, just how toxic their sexuality is, how dysfunctional it is, how dislocating it is, how fundamentally unplugged they are from being able to share um, any kind of profound or significant intimate connection, that they are in some version of some kind of enactment of some kind of visceral expressive thing. They can't actually, I mean, the best way that I can just kind of summarize this point is that there is no tantric depth in what their sexual activity includes. It's all a performative charade, and it's anyway. What's my point? Anyway, I mean, and I would say much more things about borderline personality disorder and how that is a model for this kind of sadistically edged stuff. But anyway, I've got those. This is enough of a tangent that I've indulged in now. But I covered these issues much more elegantly and fluidly in the first recording, sadly. Anyway, let me put this to bed. So that's everything. Wait, I think I did tie this up with. Man, I did tie it up with, I think, the abortion thing. Damn it, and that was such a good point. Damn it. This has already gone on too long, and this is good. But yeah, so I recently made a recording talking about the legal necessity for abortion, to have some window for abortion in order to institutionalize liberal principles and values. And I realize that my actual position as an individual is this often lampooned position that, well, I'm not personally in favor of abortion, but that uh, the state should permit some, should be permissive of it under some uh, window, at least. That is perhaps a kind of an inconsistent position. Um, anyway, I make a whole recording about this. I'm not going to recapitulate the whole argument. It's quite a long recording, but essentially I used the same argument to say that, essentially drugs should be decriminalized. Also, I think it leads to better practical outcomes. In both cases, lead to better practical outcomes, because if you don't institutionalize between the culture and the legal framework some basic fundamental respect for bootstrapping liberalism, you don't have a culture that is capable of conserving itself in terms of its, let's say, philosophical integrity and the actual scaffolding and framework of a liberal order. You don't get a liberal order that's capable of preserving itself. That's my kind of overarching argument. And Matt, I made actually such an impassioned on the last recording when I brought up these points. I made such a beautiful, perfect argument. Oh, man, it was really good about how the state that the kind of problems that the state is generating in its the kind of toxin that we're actually suffering from, or one of the ways in which this is manifesting on a systemic level in some sense, is that we don't have a mature tolerance of certain kinds of scourges or evils or something like that. The idea that something must be done by government, like is as the panacea or something like that, is essentially a kind of an inculcated moral opium and evil of our time. And I do think that the only way to guard against that, essentially, because there is a way in which the state having a kind of automatic moral infantilism over its own people is similarly mirrored by the traditional conservative moral paternalists on the right, who want to completely outlaw, for example, let's say drugs, and completely outlaw abortion. That those two things are reflections of the same thing, and in some sense, so I wish to cut against both of those toxic tendencies. And also, I always say we need a strong enough legal framework and constitution that the individual can litigate against the state when it overreaches in regulating and prescribing limits on freedom of association and such, and tries to regulate liberty or something like that. That there needs to be a structural counterbalancing force which is purely secular and which is contended through the legal structure. But anyway, man, I gave this argument much better. Now I'm just kind of describing it horribly and obtusely, but essentially that the state should be allowed to experiment with innovating and inventing public goods, but essentially, that roughly these public goods need to be opt-in. They need to be sort of optional things that people can, that the democratic will, through its political representation, can seek to perhaps try to invent these public goods. But when you have opt-in programs that aren't compulsory and coercive, that therefore they are probably going to be much better designed for being able to be judged about if they actually achieve their goals or their purposes, that they're not just creating moral hazards and dependency and exacerbating the causes of the problems that they ostensibly seek to ameliorate. So that kind of overreach, which the left is certainly prone to, I think that now obviously the right has a slightly better time, because when it is being prescriptive, it says, well, when the right is being overly prescriptive with its traditional conservative values that it wants to enshrine in the law or have etched into the legal system, it's much neater than the left, because the left, the way that it does it, it turns into a spiral. Whereas when the right does it, it's an absolute statement, which then expects society or the individual to understand, to have the reasoning or the rationale behind that imprinted on their consciousness, and say, well, this is the prescription of the democratic will of the majority of the people, has this moral standard, and that now that is fundamentally toxic in a different way, because it essentially says that you don't have to worry about your moral standing and your constitution of your own moral thinking, because there's a sociological automation in which it's going to be enforced and imposed on you. And so I do see that both of these things are reflections. Now, and I was going to even argue about a necessity of sort of spiritual politics. Man, I think maybe I didn't cut this out of my last recording. Maybe this was in another recording that I didn't make. So this might be a repeat of a recording that I made earlier. But anyway, it's probably worth repeating anyway. That I was just going to give a Christian description of the necessity of this, that Jesus, I think, Jesus was not a secular revolutionary. He was a spiritual revolutionary, but he didn't advocate for revolution against the state. Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Now, in some sense, this is true and this is not true as well, because he did actually break the law. He did break the Roman law of the Roman state, but he did so out of principle, and essentially the law that he contravened was assembly, because there is no right of assembly in the Roman Empire. Freedom of association was basically seen as a threat to this, was a crime against the state, because if you could have freedom of association, you could conspire to subvert the political power structure or something like that. It was, essentially, it was a crime against the state to have freedom of association, essentially, or to assemble without permission, without direct granting of a kind of a license to do something. Anyway, so it's interesting that Jesus says, "Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar," and in some sense, what he politically or legally explicitly does when he does break the law, when he is, let's say, slightly secularly revolutionary, because he's not calling to overthrow the state, but he does essentially oppose some of the laws of the state, although this is not explicit in the scriptures, this is the truth, what I'm saying, is that he does essentially stand up de facto for freedom of association. I mean, that's explicitly why the Christians were essentially persecuted as well. But anyway, my point is that Now, look, I've laid out thematically all the things that I want to say. Now, I don't want to do all the laborious work of tying it all up in a bow and linking it all together. But so I mean, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. So my whole point is just that basically you can't enforce moral values, and in some sense, because technically there is an overlap between the bodily autonomy of a female and the right to life of the unborn child, and because there is literally an overlap of those two rights, I would say the only secular responsible way to deal with that is to permit some window of, you have to have at least some window where you permit an abortion in order to create an institutional landmark in which you prove that liberalism is institutionalized, that philosophically you have a bootstrap liberalism. And I mean, I say this as well with the decriminalization of drugs, also because I think that these things are necessary to revealing to people the content of their own constitutions and their own values and integrity, because otherwise you make moral reasoning, you make it a purely political, in some sense the culture is obscured by the use of the state. And also, I think that it's necessary to do this because without a kind of a cultural true north that can sort of have a stable, secular, functioning legal system, you can't ever fix politics because, you know, yes, politics is a myriad web of, let's say, corruption and things like that. But unless you can create some kind of consensus that in principle has a general solution to the problems that you, because in some sense, you know, you can't try to fix the debt while you're still trying to do things that the state has no business, you know, trying to intercede and mediate or. And so I think that we need a cultural consensus or a compact about, you know, how the liberal order works philosophically. We need a civics. You know, every society does need a civic structure that undergirds it. And it is the confusion and laxity in the current civic structure, which has been overrun by a kind of state moral authority and paternalism, which I think, you know, when the left indulges in it, it can be combated by a kind of a right-wing variant of the same thing. But, you know, that kind of pendulum swinging tit for tat is, you know, don't become like the thing that you criticize. You know, don't become the thing that man, I made this argument so eloquently in the. Anyway, okay. Let me stop this bit of a train wreck. Man, yeah, I mean that was very coarse, but thematically, that's. I mean, I didn't actually. Um, I didn't cogently move from step to step in that. I just gave a kind of blotchy overview, um, of how those things. Uh, Man, I gave a very good overarching thing that essentially that is what is needed in order to have a freedom-loving culture of life, even because without that kind of you can't even inculcate a freedom a culture of life if there isn't a freedom of choice. If people can't actually see that their agency and responsibility actually has consequences, and I link this to essentially that we have to be able to tolerate certain reflections of people's moral character, because if we allow society to clean up the symptoms, if we say society should be taxed to clean up the symptoms of people's indiscretion, then you are creating a moral hazard essentially. And this is why when you have opt-in programs that are meant to fix things, in some sense, I do think private charity is the thing, is the kind of structure that can do the most kind of good. And you can have, you know, we haven't found politicians with the backbone in order to promote kind of measures like this. But, if you have a government program that is selective about its recipients, if it says, no, 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 you have to apply for this program and we don't accept everyone, that is, legally that can be sketchy. If a government can do that, you would have to lay out the criteria in pretty objective terms with pretty good rationale behind those objective criteria. It would have to be, reasoned, and I think people should have constitutional rights that would check those reasons, because although you have a democratic mandate, I think that there are secular constitutional checks that need. America doesn't have enough constitutional checks, I would argue. But anyway, that's a separate argument. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. Man, yeah, this has gotten a bit too messy. But anyway, let me end this here. Ooh, there's something I need to add to the last thematic point that I was trying to draw into it. I didn't make a cogent connection between these things, but I think this came through in my original recording, is that I was trying to say that sort of a political, secular, liberal culture, which I try to also connect with issues of psychology and sexuality and things like that, and that the British stiff upper lip and sort of polite society and certain sensibility of decorum in terms of what is permissible in sort of in the public. There's certain kinds of private views that one does not just sort of publicly air, because it's vulgar to do it outside of the confines of a freedom of association, where someone has consented to have that level of discourse or that kind of exchange or something like that. Obviously, there are some intellectual versions of that where there are exceptions to that rule. Probably that this is why you have essentially also almost like an intellectual celebrity class of intellectual elites that publicly involve themselves in debate and discourse, which gives you, because they are proficient orators that allow people to perhaps see their own worldviews reflected, or become a smorgasbord of avenues of potential self-reflection and things to model one's own thinking around or after or something like that. Anyway, what is my whole point here? Sorry, so my whole point here is that the moral landscape, as it were, has been culturally at the moment sort of polluted with this idea that there should be this kind of uniform, cookie cutter, objective, universal, sort of enforced game that everyone is forced to believe is sort of base reality, where people can say, no, 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 this is what this word means, and other people must accede to this orthodoxy or this convention or something like that. And in some sense, this was naturally mediated within a society, within natural usage of words. But now, because of things like critical theory, people are consciously trying to create an activism around controlling definitions and making semantic claims, that they're trying to artificially game the system that is, meant to be somewhat organic, and that is a part of their sociological plan for control in order to ostensibly ameliorate their definition of oppression, which is the moral foundation of their cause, essentially, to some degree. But as I've tried to say, that is very similar to the Marxian hypothesis that capitalism is unsustainable. I mean, it might be true that capitalism is unsustainable, but it's a prospective, hypothetical proposition, and then you're using that as your permission and excuse to indulge in the necessary argumentation around deconstructing and re-engineering from the ingredients of the deconstruction some kind of revolution to capitalism. That whole style of project is a kind of fundamental now in the Marxian thing, it is almost a kind of, you can almost make, because its fundamental hypothesis is essentially amoral, in the sense that it doesn't have any moral partisanship. It doesn't have a value partisanship. It's meant to be a historical sort of objective claim that capitalism is unsustainable. But critical race theory isn't premised on such an amoral hypothetical preposition. It's premised on a moral claim. The beginning point of famously Karl Marx, there were always communists before Karl Marx. Karl Marx was what made him different was that his socialism was scientific, essentially. So in that way, it was amoral. It didn't have utopian motivation or inspiration. Although I would argue that that's potentially that it did devolve into what critical race theory is, which is why when critical race theory does what it does, it's such an obvious, sort of replication of the so-called orthodox Marxist movement, which, as far as I can tell, there's nothing. Marx was a mixed bag to some degree. There are contradictory themes and sentiments represented in his own work. For all of his claims to be scientific, there are some things that are fudged quite obviously, but that's also because of when he's writing. He can't anticipate how capitalism is going to develop and unfold. In fact, I would argue that the state in which capitalism is today is so alien to what Marx thought of as capitalism that, anyway, a lot of what Marx said has to sort of be reduced down to sort of very crude, basic sentiments of digestion, of sort of ideas about how you might sort of digest things, but and deconstruct elements of issues and things like that. But I mean, perhaps people will say that I'm just making this up, but I mean, and I'm biased because of my own preoccupation in my own studies, that I would say that a lot of what, in some sense, I think my position on Marx is not even that new. That Bakunin also essentially said it's all psychological. It's not, that he thought Marx was an idiot, essentially. Bakunin was basically an anarchist, but and in that sense, I mean, I'm not well read on Bakunin, but I imagine that there's probably a lot of resonance in my own views and Bakunin's. But anyway, what's my point? Is that that also you can't even safely, I think, deal with certain ideological things unless you have a very firm grasp on the human condition to some degree, and also some kind of, I do think that a lot of ideological possession or inception in terms of mind viruses are essentially just sort of clothing for psychological sort of psychopathology. Anyway, so, and I do think that it is necessary to have something like a secular liberal political structure in order to even have a society that is capable of being sane, capable of conserving a kind of sanity in the individual, which is why, sort of, I mean, if you just look at totalitarian states, I think that they are, never mind about their material ability to reproduce their own conditions, that psychologically they're unsustainable. They are culturally hideous and essentially create a kind of insipid form of slave morality, indoctrination, that they have to essentially sustain a cold, frozen narrative that their devotion is contended within. And that frozen world that is culturally devoid of life and agency can only have something of a semblance of a freedom in a kind of reactive pocket of space within the narrative which the individual is enforced into depending on in a kind of epistemic reliabilism. And so you have, in some sense, I think that this is the true evil, that any kind of systemic oppression, I mean, this is actually the apex of that form of oppression, that the oppression that they're actually very crudely attempting to rail against is just another variation of, it is the thing that itself is complaining about. It is ultimately the sort of a kind of a masterful reproduction of the type of thing that it itself pretends to counsel people against. It's a living paradox in that way. It's a living irony. But anyway, and that without some basic societal structures, which, I mean, just to create a motif, is something like British political liberalism, and in some sense a kind of a cultural sensitivity that has a kind of stiff upper lip. Now, the British have done this organically, so I'm using the motif of of propriety and the stiff upper lip, but I don't think you need to have a culture that looks anything like that. You just need to have institutional civic structures that have actually entrenched a kind of bootstrap liberalism that everyone knows what the deal is. It's a version of a kind of social contract as a cultural compact, as a kind of civic education in some degree, but it doesn't have, in some sense, it doesn't have to, as in a civic education, not as a kind of propaganda or indoctrination, but just this is how the legal system works. This is essentially the rationale around why there is a window in which you can have legalized abortion and why drugs are decriminalized. That is the kind of that the civic education is not indoctrination. It's a description of the system, and a kind of exposition of its underlying values. And it's like, well, you can disagree with them if you want, you can be a fascist if you want, but this is how the system runs in practice and in theory, and it has a worldview essentially, or at least it has a worldview that allows for one to see the constitution of one's own choices of worldview in some sense. Now, it is, you know, the it the intolerance paradox, or what's it called? Because you have to be intolerant of intolerance. Which is if you tolerate intolerance, then it's literally self-refuting. You end up with a system that does devolve, and in some sense we live in a version of that, in that we have not properly identified the failure mode of the intolerance paradox, but we also haven't developed a sophisticated enough, comprehensive, holistic structure of values and legal institutionalized structures of framework that actually amounts to a cohesive, cogent structure that is a bit sophisticated, so it's hard to just kind of defend when it's not actually in operation, so that you can describe it through its component parts, and how it amounts into a working, practicing worldview or something like that. But in some sense, when we remove the moral confusion and quandary around, when we have the right onus within culture over people's choice of their behavior and things like that, or we've decriminalized drugs. There are also really cool things that you can do when you decriminalize drugs, because just because you decriminalize buying drugs and using them doesn't mean that you can't have as a crime introducing a drug to a person under a certain age. I would even say that ideally, if people are going to take drugs, you could even have different bans. You could say, well, if you introduce drugs to someone under the age of 18, that's a criminal offense. And in some sense, there should hopefully be no profit incentive for people to do that, because if drugs are decriminalized and they're sold legally, then perhaps the profit margin becomes so low that there's no point in pushing them onto people. Or you could, if you legalize them, then you can essentially prohibit the marketing of them in the same way that perhaps you prohibit the marketing of cigarettes and things like that. So you could still have regulations like that. And anyway, the point is that you could have essentially that it's illegal even to introduce people to drugs under the age of 25, because people's brains are still developing. Ideally, people should not even take alcohol until after the age of 25. It's not good for people's brain development. So that just because it's decriminalized doesn't mean that you can't also then create other sort of prescriptive measures to kind of try to nudge the culture towards having certain values or something like that, or at least popularizing, don't do that, it's against the law, don't introduce that person to that drug, because that is actually technically against the law, or something like that. I would say that perhaps it should be a crime to introduce people to a drug that is a habit-forming substance. Then every time someone says, oh, well, you might try that, they would have to couch it in a kind of disclaimer or a caveat. And then, I think that is a level of sort of prescribed decorum that the law would then be doing, that essentially you could say, oh, no, I didn't introduce this person to the drug because I disclaimed it. So I didn't introduce it. They introduced it to themselves. I didn't push it on them. I didn't encourage them. I didn't buy it for them. They bought it for themselves, So you would have to, well, if you want to take that, you have to go and buy it for, so people, it forces the culture to recognize the value of of people agentically exercising their own agency, pursuing their own agency, and then owning the consequences of their own actions, as it were. Anyway, so and so, I mean, I think it can be useful to even have laws like that legislatures try to draw. Because, it's interesting because if a legislature might profanely try to criminalize introducing people to drugs, and the courts might be very reticent in actually convicting people of that crime, but it can still be a crime on the books. So in some sense, it can still be a kind of an issue of public policy. It can essentially be a statement of public policy. And I'm saying things that are probably alien to some people, but because the legal system doesn't quite work in some jurisdictions the way it works in a substantive, principled, sort of organic system that's properly cohesive. But anyway, so I'm jumping around a lot. Anyway, I just wanted to link this concept with, the kind of the projection of people's, in some sense, their sexuality into a kind of ideological politics, into a universal objective, sort of political sphere of sort of that there is only one game and everyone has to follow the rules, and it's kind of authoritarian, which is the only thing that facilitates people being able to conceal their kind of individual, sadistically edged grifting using the mechanisms that are kind of unprincipled in their application, that have these kinds of moral, because I do think that there is, I don't want to say loophole, but there is a moral vacancy in the sort of, oh, well, drugs are dangerous, so we're going to just criminalize them because they're dangerous for people to use on themselves. Like, that is a true statement. Drugs are, in general, that's a generalization. That is as true as a generalization can ever be. But it's a kind of moral truth that is not the sort of thing that can be, I think. It's a general truth that has a moral status, which is not something that can be imposed by the state on its citizenry, I think, in order to safeguard and conserve the dignity of the individual and the dignity of the agent, to not infantilize the citizenry, because it's that fundamental infantilization which I think is what gives people, therefore, the leftist expectation that the state should solve all problems, that the state must do something. And in some sense, that fundamentally runs awry because it can only treat symptoms, and there are some causative issues which you can't throw money at. You can't, because you need actually to bootstrap a principle to actually have any kind of coherence within the system and sanity. And I think it's a kind of sanity that has been rebelled against in this kind of mad dash for state, executive and legislative levers of power. And I think that, I'll be blunt. I think that the Constitution needs to be more robust, and that the judiciary needs to be more. This is slightly dangerous in a practical sense, because I do think that essentially the judiciary needs to be the strongest arm of government, because that is what magnifies the power of the citizenry. That the citizen actually has justiciable rights against the state itself, which under the current American system certainly does not. The rights in the Constitution, the American Constitution, are so absolute that they are worthless, because they are just always defined as not being infringed. they are semantically interpreted as not being violated. It's pathetic. You essentially don't have justiciable rights because the law in America is not substantively etched into principles. It is being explored. The principles are being explored. You can't have that. You have to have set principles, the application of which are being discovered. You can have common law extrapolation and extension, but they are extended from existing principles and axioms that are predominant, and you can maybe work out hybridized amalgamates of the already existing ones, although now I'm already kind of not talking strictly about a common law system. I'm talking about something like my legal system has, which is the principles of the Roman Dutch reception of the laws of Justinian. But which does have a full philosophical principled system of maxims and principles, but and it does have a complete substantive law that is done in principle. But in America, the law is not complete. The law itself is trial and error. What is lawful in principle at one time is subject to vast amendment and replacement the next year. They are not quibbling over how to interpret the application of the law. They are quibbling over the law itself, which is repromulgated constantly. This is slightly not true in terms of the constitutional law, but the constitutional law is defunct for reasons that I've already stated. The constitutional law in America is frankly, it's not fit for a citizen anywhere. It's a nice idea, it's a good propaganda, it's a good rhetoric, it's a good ethos for a culture, but it's pathetic law. It's non-justiciable. The American constitutional rights are fundamentally non-justiciable. They are void for vagueness. They have no clear remedies. There are some remedies for some things, but it's a line in the sand, and that line is so pathetically interpreted. It's embarrassing. I mean, even famously, people say, in some sense, half correctly, this is the problem with the American Constitution, is that you didn't need the civil rights at all, because equal protection under the law is a constitutional commitment in the American legal system. That it was already there. And it just shows you the feeble nature of the American legal structure. And in some sense, that's because you had to create a legal structure that was in some sense the vindication of the American Revolution as to why the legal structure and why you needed a divorce from the British Empire, because it was, in terms of the justice of, taxation without representation, but no one had actually devised a system that was comprehensive, and so America was conceived of as an experiment, as a laboratory in some sense, and it kind of got everything right. It got the culture right, but the only way to kind of produce some scaffolding and bones within that culture was essentially to use the legal framework as as a propaganda agency for liberty, which is a good propaganda to have. It's not a bad ethos, but it's a misuse of what the law itself is, because essentially America does not have the rule of law, which does not mean what people ordinarily think it means. The rule of law means that laws are prospective, that they have objective criteria, that you know what they mean before you can actually you can have clarity over what is lawful, what is not lawful. You don't have justiciable constitutional rights, and everything is up for repromulgation and extrapolation, and wherever the legislature wants to go. The law itself is not complete. The law is fundamentally in the hands of man. And in fact, Americans don't even understand the basic nature of the rule of law. They think that there's no alternative to that. There's no alternative to experimenting with rules, that there are no principles that can actually create a substantive framework that does actually function as a standalone part of a society, of a secular society. So I would say that the perfection of the common law was when the common law was amalgamated in my country with the Roman Dutch substantive law, which is in principle a law that was, that came out of a society that had tyrants in it, but even the tyrants had to respect the law, even the tyrant, because the law itself was not offensive to the tyrant, because it actually did respect power in a blind kind of way, but in a principled way that kept a kind of coherence that no one would ever think to mess with the law, because they had legislative power, because the law and the legislature, the legislature in, or the plenary power of the tyrant or whatever, did not change the principles. Anyway, this is a bit. I'm not describing this issue too well, but perhaps people that know about this issue can see the gist of what I'm kind of outlining. Anyway, let me stop this recording. I've ranted on for long enough, and I've repeated all these issues before. So this is a common hobby horse for me. Oh man, this is now this recording is far too large and has gone off into too many different tangents and things like that. But I finished watching the second recording, which is the first recording with James Lindsay is like 19 minutes. The second recording, the second video, is a 25-minute video where he's talking to some conservative, I guess, who is also, sort of critical of critical race theory. And then, he, oh my word, this guy, this Marc Lamont Hill, this person is in the same moral category as a Nazi. There is no distinction in my mind in the kind of moral level. I mean, this person might as well have been a Nazi. I mean, he has the same philosophical worldview. It's absolutely identical. There's not an iota of different. I mean, this guy is essentially a black Nazi. I mean, it's anyway. I mean, that's probably that seems inflammatory, I guess, in someone's judgment. But I mean, really, the disgust that I have, even the level of intellectual crazy. I mean, this guy is a lunatic. I mean, his intellectual position is so superficial. His retorts, his arguments, I mean, it's so juvenile, it's so childish, it is so thin and pathetic. He makes arguments which undermine the substance of his own fucking position, and he doesn't even fucking realize it. I mean, it is pathetic. And his diatribe, I mean, watching this 25-minute recording, I wish I had the setup of basically of watching it live and then pausing it and then commenting and watching it more and pausing and commenting it, just to deconstruct all of the myriad of dishonesty. I mean, I mean, this is begging the question. All of his, I mean, you can see in terms of how he entertains the interlocutor, how he treats the interlocutor. Oh, I respect your view. I respect your view because I respect that my interpretation of you is that you are self-identifying as an unconscious bigot, and I respect my labeling of you as an unconscious bigot. So I respect your view. I mean, like, what kind of semantic witchcraft is this? I mean, it is disgusting. It is, and then he's like, just wait there. I respect your view. Just hold on with that. And this is how I see it. I was kidnapped from Africa, or my ancestors were kidnapped. It was my ancestors were kidnapped, but I was kidnapped from Africa. I mean, I'm not delusional. I'm not engaged in magical thinking where I'm stuck in a time capsule, because that's the only way that my narrative and my worldview makes sense. That time is conflated into this moral paradigm in which historical determinism is confused with moral causation. So that essentially we can say, well, because historically there was institutionalized racism, we always live under the inheritance of that until my subjective interpretation of statistics and generalizations has reached some parity point, because it's not as if any of these statistics can be absolved of essentially the involvement of the race card. It's not as if any of these statistics could be blown apart and seen that race has got nothing to do with it if you apply a multivariate analysis, because there's this historical issue which then I can just fudge and presume that is the overriding cause, that intersection, and I'm just essentially table thumping that intersectionality is the cause of every outcome. I mean, does the begging of the question never end? I mean, this is a unilateral narrative that's being peddled. I mean, it's pathetic. I mean, you can't. There's no reason. There's no. Has this person even tried to falsify their own disgusting theory that everything is evidence of racism? Have they ever done that? Have they ever looked for a countervailing, ulterior explanation for anything? No, because they've got a beautiful reductionist, which is a de facto essentialism. Oh, and then he keeps on saying, oh, no, we're not essentialist. We are forced into our essentialist paradigm because that is what the nature of the oppression is that the essentialism that we are essentially living through has been enforced onto us by the ideological scapegoat, by your invention of whiteness. So he's like, I didn't invent the essentialism, you're projecting it onto me. I'm claiming that you're projecting it onto me, so it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to you. It's because of you, it's not because of me. I mean, what kind of, the kind of bullshit. I mean, this is why it's so disgusting and dishonest and reprehensible, because you can't have an honest discourse with these people. It's impossible, because they just keep on playing definitional, semantic, the goalpost shifting in terms of what things mean, in terms of it's just word games essentially, to shift the onus of providing substantiation that they don't have to substantiate. They hold the default statistical inference, inductively supports them. They don't have to prove deductive substantiations of any of their articles of that inform their belief, that are the premises of their worldview. Which is why that they can only exert pushback, because essentially they just have a sentiment. They just have it's a feeling. It's a fucking fascistic social psychology caricature of reality. Which is essentially, as again, it makes the bold claim, the bold thing that it is actually all hinged on, is that historical causation is a fact that no one can deny, or is a form of analysis that seems rational, eminently rational, and logical. So because historical determinism is a way of explaining how anything happens, then they've got a way to sociologically ground moral causation by just conflating history into and projecting it onto the present. So you get these magical thinking thoughts like, I was kidnapped from Africa. That because you can't argue with the history, that then, as if the person that he's talking to is saying that that didn't happen. But because history is history, then the moral causation follows that he must be able to scapegoat whiteness and the white identity as the cause of all the statistical variance in being a perfect spread across the population. Can't look at anything else. Can't look at the lack of bootstrapped agency in a culture. Can't look at the kind of the epistemic reliabilism which is inherent in this person's worldview. Can't look at the fact that he's literally makes sense of the world through a slave morality, through an ideological external locus of control. That it can't be that. It can't be that whiteness is actually a construct of racist black people that can't actually develop without the built-in reactive excuse of voting for politics that make sense, that don't just pander into the same, it can't be any of that, because accountability is not something that can, who's putting accountability in the white hand? Who's imposing the external locus of control and power within their ideological schema? It can't be any of that. The systemic oppression thing is a form of very deeply entrenched racism that basically invented in like the 1960s, and it's interesting that I would say culturally before it took hold. I would even argue that it is what destroyed progress to a large extent. Yeah, if you just look at the family, and you do, as if there aren't poor white people in America, as if there isn't white trash in America that has the exact kind of ills and problems that urban black folk have, that it isn't the same, it. But yeah, that was quite disgusting when he tried to sort of unsettle the interlocutor by saying, well, actually, it's not Asian people that do well. It's if you break down Asians into different ethnic groups, then you actually realize that it's Cambodians aren't doing well. It's only the Chinese and the Japanese. What? What a self-refuting retort to make. Because you can also break it down and say, well, it's not the Japanese, because there are perhaps some Japanese and some Chinese who don't have the same culture. So it's actually a particular cultural, you could always derive it into non-racialist phenomena. And yes, you could say that, well, people treat other people based on generalizations. And generally those generalizations, usually there is some kind of basis to that generalization. it just so happens that, you know, if you people will make generalizations. They're not moral. They're never going to have moral standing. People who are ethical people will know that their generalizations will lead them into certain tendencies of unethical behavior if they don't place caveats, conscious caveats, around their generalizations. And in some sense, some generalizations are worth acting on, even though, let's say, that they could lead to racial profiling. I mean, if you say to yourself, I won't be in a certain place at a certain time, you know, I won't go into that neighborhood or that place in the middle, at 3 a.m. in the morning, at 2 a.m. in the morning, late at night, I wouldn't put myself in that position. Is that not a form of racial profiling? I mean, like, it's just, but that is not a morally charged question about planning if you can and cannot be somewhere at a certain time. That's not morally, you know, morally that's a fairly neutral question. Obviously, if you have an individual that you are interviewing because you are a boss and you are looking for an employee, you know, you can have assumptions about someone, you can have generalizations about someone, but since you have an interview with them, you have all the luxury to be able to make an assessment in spite of one's generalizations. You know, you should be conscious of your generalizations so that you can control for them and be ethically and morally but the idea that people should either not have generalizations or that they should or that all generalizations are a kind of are a cultural are a kind of cultural sin, that we should not have generalizations because there should be some kind of perfect equilibrium between intersectional identity factions, is such a stupid authoritarian excuse to indulge in a kind of cultural psychological terrorism for juvenile narcissists and what I would call cerebral histrionics, which is what this black host, this lunatic, is indulging in. I mean, you know, sort of, it's a kind of intellectual terrorism. You know, it's you know, he never substantiates his points. He's just volleying these barrages of begging the question and sort of claiming the default, you know, that everyone else has to prove a negative, and his view is just as valid as everybody else's view, because he's a kind of he's a group relativist. So as long as that enough people believe in his view, then essentially it deserves respect or something like that, because he doesn't, you know, it's I mean, it's disgusting. You know, he treats people as emissaries of sort of factions of humanity, which are kind of like cultural, psychological islands, and he's trying to create a kind of you know, in the same way that Hitler imagined that essentially all the nations of the world would be in a kind of loose kind of coalition Cold War, a kind of, because they need each other to be distinct from one another, to be in a kind of frozen competitive conflict, so that they can sort of have because you need an out-group in order to have a cohesive in-group. Essentially, you need the threat of the other. You need the external pressure to outline the boundary of the internal, because you don't have a proper sort of sense of integrity without that kind of external pressure. It's a kind of sort of neo-colonialism, actually. It's exactly what it is. I mean, it's amazing that these people complain about settler colonialism when they are themselves essentially perpetrating a kind of ideological totalitarianism, but you know, that essentially that everyone should have a kind of ethno-state or ethnocentric political representation, that everyone should kind of be in the model of a kind of some kind of almost Chinese sort of Stalinist vanguardism, you know. Some kind of hybrid between Leninism and sort of what sort of the Chinese government sort of does for its identity and bestowing dignity on its identity within its within being the guardian of the interests of its identity. Uh, oh my word! It's just it's just so depressing.